Okay, so let's first understand the Sabbath and why it's so very important within Judaism. And according to the website Judaism 101, the Sabbath is the best known and yet the least understood of all the Jewish observances. They write that the people who do not observe Sabbath think of it as a day filled with stifling restrictions or as a day of solemn prayer. But those who observe Sabbath understand it as a precious gift from God and a great day eagerly awaited, a day that one can set aside all their weekday concerns and devote themselves to a higher pursuit. Sabbath is one of, if not the most important ritual observance in Judaism. It is the only ritual codified in the Ten Commandments. And Sabbath really is primarily a day of rest, of spiritual enrichment. A day of feasting when meals are much more elaborately experienced and much more leisurely fashioned. So the Sabbath involves two interrelated commandments: to remember, zakor, and to observe, shema. Two interrelated commandments, to remember and to observe. Now, the Sabbath begins at nightfall on Friday and lasts until nightfall on Saturday. In practical terms, the Sabbath starts a few minutes before sunset on Friday and runs until an hour after sunset on Saturday. So it literally lasts 25 hours. So honoring the Sabbath is a reminder of the covenant and the gift from God. It is a place of calm, a time of stillness in life. Now, we're going to focus on that place of calm, a time of stillness, and what that looks like for us, or may look like for us. But before we get there, we just need to notice the tension and the conflict that the story involves. It's centered on a perceived illegal act, a serious breaking of the law. This is no small act by the disciples. It is a violation of the tradition of Torah obedience. The story records Jesus going through the grain fields. His disciples begin to pluck heads of grain, not good. The Pharisees see it, so they question, are the disciples guilty of violating Sabbath law because they plucked a few heads of grain as they made their way through the field? The Pharisees say they are guilty. Now, Jesus' response is interesting because he does not defend the disciples' actions by denying the accusation. Instead, he appeals to the case of David's illegal consumption of the bread, the presence, the holy, in the tabernacle. And Jesus uses this known historical story, which, by the way, has nothing to do with Sabbath, to make his point. He is not proving the disciples to be innocent, but rather demonstrating to the Pharisees that their violation is justified by a higher obligation. Justified by a higher obligation. Hold on to that notion. And then Jesus, now hear this. On the Sabbath, Jesus deliberately heals the hand of a man, and he does it right in front of the Pharisees' eyes. He is making a statement. Jesus' healing is not a life or death situation for the man. Now, granted, the man has needs to be addressed, but it seems more about Jesus' refusing to observe the convention, traditions, and obligations of honoring the Sabbath than it does about healing the man's hand. And the Pharisees get the point. And immediately they head off to begin plotting the demise of Jesus. Now, at least in this story, Jesus as the American folk singer Hume Blumenfeld would say, turned into this long-haired, radical social Jew. Jesus was protesting, making a point that the Sabbath, the Pharisees' understanding of the Sabbath was wrong. So I learned very early that nobody likes protesters. Growing up, the TV coverage of the civil rights movement in the Vietnam or on evening news, it was a ritual. The United Farm Workers strikes, boycotts, and campaigns from 65 to 75. The 1977 Nestle boycott. My dad about lost his hair. He was not keen on protesters, and not many people are. I cherish the arguments around the kitchen table I had with my father. If nothing else, he taught me how to argue and not to listen. He taught me it was futile to protest. But also remember, he told me how not to listen. Now, more recently, I stood out a few times with the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence here in Sarasota, and while holding a sign that read something like, "Background checks a good idea," without exception, a not-so-nice finger gesture was offered by motorists driving by. Nobody likes protesters. Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, the Dakota Access Pipeline, Me Too. There are plenty of protesting going on these days, and here nobody likes protesters. Now, lately there's been interesting conversations occurring at the Wismers centered on the National Football League's announcement that everyone should stand up for the national anthem. Doesn't matter who's on what side or on the other side, it does matter that we don't like protesters. And if I only had one more argument with my dad, that's what happens when someone dies, you wish for one more time. If I had one more time with my father, this would be the argument, the debate we would have around that table. I would just like blurt out, "But Pop, of all things, is not kneeling a posture of reverence? A position at worship?" Face turning redder and redder. "Don't we bow down in the presence of the divine? Are not our ancient texts filled with stories about kneeling, acknowledging God as transcendent beyond human understanding?" I'm not pausing now, because as soon as I pause, he gets his words in. "Has it not been said, Pop?" I would say, his head about to explode. "Isn't kneeling also a way of admitting our imperfection and a confession to sin, to ask for forgiveness for our transgressions, to commit ourselves to seeking a better world and confronting the injustices as well as our personal shortcomings? Kneeling is not, Pop, a position of prayer." God, I miss my father. I could just imagine that expression on his face. Okay, so I'm really sorry about that, but it was really a nice memory. In the article by Sojourners, there was an article written that Jesus was a protester, and the author writes, "Jesus devoted his life to speaking, helping, supporting, defending, empowering, healing, freeing, loving everyone, especially those who were in desperate need because of the hands of the oppressor, of the officials, the mobs, all those who intend on harming and killing them." Jesus was mocked and ridiculed and abused and arrested because he dared to become a protester. And it is on the cross where God's incarnate presence proved to the world that love does triumph over evil. And grace trumps revenge, and mercy trumps meanness, and generosity trumps selfishness, and hope trumps fear. And God trumps Satan. So we need to realize in this story that Jesus is making a very poignant point. He's not only a challenger of authority, he's the interpreter of truth. He protests because of a higher obligations. The Pharisees were obsessed with keeping the tradition by preserving Sabbath appearances. But they had missed the vision. Jesus was passionate about redefining in order for us to re-experience this holy time. Pastor once preached, Jesus is proclaiming in word and deed a new way of understanding God. He proclaims to his own generation and to every generation, including ourselves, that God is not confined to the rules about God or our ways of perceiving God. Jesus is reconfiguring our relationship to God. He reminds us that we are meant for God. So the protester in this story forces us to tarry with the notion of Sabbath. Can we really reestablish a sense of Sabbath into the hectic pace of our world? Into our culture of immediate accessibility? I know exactly what time it is and exactly how much time I have to go, and I got 3 text messages since I started. 2 not so good. Can we reestablish a sense of Sabbath with the constant activity, the rapid change, the increased stressors, the choices and options, the decisions, all needing our attention and resources? Can we reestablish that sense of Sabbath in the midst of information overload, 24-hour media coverage, fearfulness? Is not our culture in conflict with the sense of Sabbath? It takes desire, intentionality, and practice to enter a place of calm and a time of stillness. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, in his book The Sabbath, writes, 6 days a week we live under the tyranny of things of space. On the Sabbath we try to become attuned to the holiness in time. It is a day on which we are called upon to share in what is eternal in time, to turn from the results of creation to the mystery of creation, from the world of creation to the creation of the world. There's a Sabbath prayer that says, "Let me learn to pause, if only this day. Let me enter into a quiet world this day." Sabbath is to become what Jesus intends, the oasis of calm and a time of stillness. Because when we sit in the stillness, when we sit in Sabbath, all the goodness becomes more alive. And when we sit in Sabbath, we're much more available to experience God's presence. So in respect, Sabbath is introspective, but it's not self-focused. It is actually outward, focused on God and family and friends and strangers. It is the experience of goodness, Sabbath is. We taste the goodness of God's gift of life when we sit in Sabbath. Sabbath may be literally an act of protest in our world. And it's not some archaic act, but it is, as someone said, subversive cultural practice for us today that affords us the possibility to recognize and resist the powerful, unchosen elements of cultural identity. Sabbath is to choose God. So this sitting in Sabbath draws us out of the ceaseless flow of our business or our busyness in order to help reorient our attention to the most important things that matter. And this is where we see those. So in your head right now, what are the most important things that matter? Because they matter. They are the most important things. And this Sabbath place, this stillness of time, offers us a means of keeping the urgent, the demand from constantly trumping what we actually count as most important. It counters the drive to be more than we are, to control more than we do, to extend our power and effectiveness, to brings us back to teach us how to be fully present. So I pondered this morning, and I realized that cultivating a sense of Sabbath requires us not to be involved and engaged in the tasks. And that is so difficult for us who need to stay busy. Slowing down becomes an intentional discipline, a necessary discipline. But also I realize that for others, life has already become a bit slower. Life's experiences have left you alone. Health issues have depleted your energy. And life might feel slow enough for you. So the activity of experiencing Sabbath may be different for you. Some need to slow down, and some are slow enough. But let me remind you again that it involves those two interrelated commands: to remember and to observe. Because the point and the purpose, what Jesus wants us to know, is this Sabbath is to help us not forget God. And so the next question I wish for you to ponder: what helps you to remember God and to experience God? And that's practicing Sabbath. And that's what Jesus wants us to embody, not the mere act of observance, but rather the embodiment of the meaning of what it is to observe, to undertake Sabbath life. So the first question is, what is most important? The second question for you this day is, what helps you remember and experience God? Marmadon suggests that activity that is enjoyable and freeing and not undertaken for the purpose of accomplishment qualifies as acceptable Sabbath time. So that becomes your challenge. The last question: what brings you joy? And when you sit with joy, you sit in the stillness of time and a place of calm. And you get to experience God. Amen? Amen.